if if I was a progressive, I would put a trigger warning in front of this topic. It is very heavy and terrifying, and uh, it is the story about the story coming out of the UK about the decades of abuse that young girls have suffered at the hands of um, Pakistani and Armenian organized rape gangs. And I think it's fair to say that tens of thousands of young girls have been systematically groomed into these gangs' clutches and systematically abused. The stories of what happened in Canadian residential schools, the true stories, actually pale in comparison, and they are frightening. And it goes to show that while we might have better technology, we might have, you know, you know, modernity as it is, we are still broadly capable of committing atrocities by sins of commission and sins of omission. I'm going to talk about this from a psychological perspective, from an individual psychological perspective, from a group dynamic perspective. See if I can shed some light on the scope of this problem. And I'm going to introduce a word that is not common in our parlance, and that word is holon, and the related word is holarchic. The reason I'm introducing this idea, and there's other ways of talking about this phenomena or this nature. And I wrote a piece for Colin Wright and Reality's Last Stand in the fall of last year about Gnosticism and alchemy, and it's kind of a central tenet of that being as above, so below, which just loosely translates as what happens at small scale can repeat the same pattern at large scale. And that's the root of the idea of holons. So family dynamic, and I've had experience in circles where people are healing and getting past family dynamics, and done extensive amounts of reading on this issue, abusive family systems or toxic family systems. And those patterns of toxicity replicate themselves at scale if we allow it to happen. So what's happening in the UK is a large scale dysfunctional system of human dynamics, but the patterns are exactly the same as happen in dysfunctional abuse and addiction dynamics at the family level. So let's identify the players in the abusive family system. We have, of course, the abuser. The abuser or the addict or the manipulator might be a cluster B personality. They might be a drug addict. They might be an alcoholic. They might be a high control personality, whatever kind of language you want to apply to it. And that individual, particularly if they're a cluster B personality, and by that I mean psychopath, sociopath, narcissist, or a borderline, some combination of histrionic fits into cluster B as well. They manipulate and control their image environment. Their own unstable sense of self requires them to project a false persona to the world. And what they do is they project this false persona as a family super self, because they want to hide the dysfunction. They don't want to be exposed as leaders of a dysfunctional unit, and so they create a false persona not only for themselves but for the entire family. And the family culture becomes one of secrets where people aren't allowed to talk about the abuse that's happening, whether that's sexual abuse, physical, psychological, emotional abuse that might happen in these systems. And in that system, so we have the abuser that creates a false self projected to the world, and a false family super self, a false image of the family dynamic. And then there's the target within the system. So I won't get into details about my experience here, but I've been through healing circles and heard stories of people who went to the Kamloops Indian Residential School, for example, people who were recovering from addiction, people who grew up in families where there was serious psychological and emotional abuse. And I've heard direct stories and experiences from people who've been through this. And you hear stories where there's a predator within the family, and they routinely will abuse one of the siblings. And in some cases, siblings will try and protect each other. In some cases, one will sacrifice themselves more or less for the to protect another one. And in most cases, everybody in the system knows what's going on, but nobody talks about it. Okay, so the enabler, which is typically the spouse of the abusive individual, could be now in most cases sexual abuse is male. I'm fine to agree on that. But there are emotional and psychological abusers who are also women, and so you've got typically the heads of the family, the masculine, feminine, and one is the abuser and one is the enabler. And the enabler will make excuses for and cover up and maintain the culture of secrecy and by extension the culture of lies that exists within the family. And the victim of the abuse or the victims of the abuse are convinced by the abuser. We all know this. That in the sexual grooming of children, very often the abuser will convince the child that this is our little secret. Okay, so this culture of secrecy can exist at this family level, and so you've got the abuser, you have the enabler, the keeper of secrets, the one who kind of enforces that culture of secrecy and gives the abuser the capacity to perpetuate their abuse. You have the target or the victim of abuse, whether it's sexual, emotional, psychological, physical, and then you have other people in the dynamics. There can be a golden child, often is a golden child, and that is the child in the family system or the role in the family system that is elevated to illustrate the false identity of the and to show off to prove the claim of virtue in the family. So you've got this golden child, and attention, affection, resources, praise is heaped onto the golden child. No one can criticize the golden child within the family, and they are held up as the example of how high functioning the family is. And then very typically, and normally there is someone within the system who is the whistleblower. And the whistleblower is a kind of a two-sided archetype or it's a two-sided coin. You have this whistleblowing and you have a scapegoat role. And because the whistleblower threatens to undermine the reputation of the family identity, the false self or the false projected reality, they become the victims of attack and discrediting. So they are their reputation is smeared within the family, or threats of reputational smearing within the family are made. No one's going to believe you. And very often the abuser and the enabler will proactively spread information about this member of the family to say that they're liars, that they are just seeking attention, that they have psychological problems, and basically the family system gaslights the whistleblower, and directly to the whistleblower claims or gaslights that what they're seeing isn't real, that's not really happening, that you're just trying to cause trouble, and all of these things get projected onto the family scapegoat. So there are more than 5 roles, but these are the typical ones: the abuser, the enabler, the victim, the golden child, and the whistleblower. I started with this idea of holons and holarchy, and this notion of as above, so below. That human systems, there's only a limited number of games that we play. That these systems occur at scale, so they can occur in institutional dynamics. They can occur in social dynamics. The bullying dynamic, which is often associated with childhood, but really bullying is an equal opportunity and an equal age kind of phenomena, happens in workplaces and educational institutions, and we're seeing it in cancel culture, because the progressive worldview and the progressive structures that have taken over our institutions in the West are abusive, and they have created this idea of virtue. It's a false persona, a false super self, about the nature of progressivism. We protect the marginalized. We're all about people's human rights. All the virtue signaling that the progressive super self presents to the world, the claims that they make, the false claims and the false identity that they project, are very much like the abuse dynamic, and they simultaneously. This is group psychology. They can't be reflective, and they can't recognize the toxicities of their own patterns, because they externalize them and they project them onto the scapegoats in society. So we've seen over the last decades that no one believes the victims, that the government institutions, the police, the media, the British Parliament, everyone is in on this game. It's just a question of which role they're playing. So are they enabling? Are they spreading the false persona, the false super self of the institutions of Britain, playing the virtue game, and then pointing at scapegoats, and then pointing at sort of the golden children and the examples of how great we are and the reasons why we're so great. And then we have a culture of the lost child, the people who get spit out of the system. So we see in Britain the people who have been silenced, who have been trying to speak out about this for decades. The obvious example is Tommy Robinson, who is in solitary confinement in prison right now on trumped up charges. He's become the target or the scapegoat for the problems, because the super self of this culture of abuse cannot recognize its own toxicity. It refuses to be held to account. So the only way to escape that accountability is to put the blame onto somebody else. And so the working class people of Britain who are being thrown into prison for social media posts for speaking the truth, the whistleblowers within the system, are being attacked and suppressed. Keir Starmer has set up kangaroo courts and rapid courts to convict people for social media posts and speech that reflect the truth of what's happening. And this entire motivation, this super self identity, is that we are inclusive, that we are not racist, right? So the problem here is that the golden child, these identity groups of immigrants in British society, cannot be criticized. They're the golden children in the dynamic. We don't want to upset them because of our identity. We're multicultural, we're inclusive, we are a diverse society, and so we don't want to upset the apple cart by criticizing the golden child. These are simple concepts, but they're not commonly understood from the perspective of in the West anyway, thousands of year old cosmology and wisdom, as above, so below. The individual psyche, in modern language, called internal family system. So the whole School of Clinical Psychology and Clinical Therapy. Internal family systems recognizes that at the individual level, we all have these parts of us within ourselves. So we have a part of us, if we grew up like I did in an abusive family system, that established relationships with each of the players within that system. It kind of like a socket that we have that we plug into. And I was the whistleblower and the scapegoat in my family system. But I also have internal to me a part of me that's my father, a part of me that's my mother, a part of me that's my sister, a part of me that's my brother, and those parts all had roles within the system. And it's a question of which one stands at the forefront of our psyche or our persona, or in kind of more Freudian terms, our ego, and the one that we present to the world. So there are many people who grew up in these toxic family systems, and they take on the ego, the dominant ego role of the abuser, or they take on the dominant ego role of the enabler, and they play out those roles in their own families again, or they participate at scale in group coherence in society, like we're seeing right now. And it's embarrassing and shameful to watch Keir Starmer in the British House deflect and deny and to still, they've passed laws against criticizing Islam in the UK. And before Christmas last year, there was a bill put forward that would make illegal the desecration of Islamic texts. So making something immune from criticism is a symptom of a toxic system. And that's the reason why, all of this is the reason why in the West we've established societies based on freedom of speech, so that we can speak openly about the kinds of tyrannies of lies and false egos and false personas and personalities and super selves, group identities that can emerge under tyranny. My name is Shannon B. Douglas. I've been studying group dynamics. My current project is looking at the social contagion of gender ideology. And this is a solo piece for the Canadian Culture Wars report, talking about larger issues and sort of the bigger psychological psychodynamics of the issues that are happening, not just in the UK, but in Canada. And this is the week that our king of false super selves and virtue signaling, Justin Trudeau, has resigned, and like a typical abusive person does, leaves chaos in his wake. I hope this was helpful and interesting, and gave you some ways to think about these kinds of problems in the world, and that maybe as you're watching the media and consuming the media and conversation about this issue, you can start identifying some of these dynamic roles. Who's the enabler? Who's denying what's happening here and making it so that it can happen? Who is the abusive, participating in the abusive cohort of the system? Who's taking advantage of this? Who is the golden child that can't be criticized? Who are the whistleblowers and the scapegoats? And who are the victims? Who are the targets of this kind of abuse? It happens and operates exactly the same way at the dysfunctional and toxic family system level as it does at the social level. There we go. Hope this was helpful.